Last week, or not last week, last lesson, we spent a lot of time talking about the importance of salt in cooking. And I mentioned the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Samin Nosrat. Today's lesson is also pulled almost directly from her book. We'll be talking about heat. So heat plays a really crucial role in the kitchen. But what is heat? Heat is it's the transfer of energy from your heating source, whether that's a stove, an oven, a grill, and it moves it into your food to cause chemical reactions at the molecular level. I'm not going to dive super deep into all that, so don't worry, you don't need a chemistry degree to understand what's going on here. But I just want to kind of skim that so you understand the importance of heat and how it reacts with your food. Now, in order to become more comfortable with heat and to utilize it properly, the best advice that can be given is just cook every day. Use your elements every day in some way, shape, or form. And if you can't do that, do it as often as you can. Heat can yield a lot of different things for us. It's responsible for browning, boiling, steaming, blistering, creating smoke. All of those essential parts of cooking we could not have without the discovery of fire eons and eons ago, right? But no two heat sources are exactly the same. The best analogy or the best real life example of this is an oven. So if you were to set your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, the heating element could climb as high as 370 before the safety feature shuts it off and then stops heating up any higher. So 370 degrees, that's about 20 degrees, it's exactly 20 degrees higher than your target. Now, that will then slowly drop because the heating element has been turned off. So we'll slowly get passed down, we're at 350, and then we'll continue to go down further as far as 330 or sometimes even lower depending on your particular oven. So the amount of time that the oven is actually at 350 is negligible. There's no real set amount of time because the mechanism in my newer oven is very different than the mechanism that was in my oven from the 1950s. It's just a matter of difference. I think the biggest advice that can be given, especially with an oven, is it's not about the number. It's not about exactly at 350. It's about understanding how your heating element and your cooking surface reacts with the food and what your desired outcome is. So there are a lot of desired outcomes from heat. We could achieve smoke by burning. We could achieve softening by poaching or boiling. In the case of harder greens, think collards, for instance, which have a lot of that very tough cellulose. By lightly poaching them before cooking them, we've broken down some of those cell walls and not only made the nutrients within them more available, but we've softened them so that our bodies are better able to digest them. And we've unlocked flavors. In the case of a raw carrot, if you eat a raw carrot versus a boiled carrot, you'll notice that the boiled carrot has much sweeter tones. Now, there's no extra sugar being added. What we're seeing is the breakdown of starch leaching out into the water, and then the simple sugars being concentrated inside of that carrot. These are all things that we can achieve through boiling and poaching and simmering. If we want to look more toward the sort of aggressive side of heat, we look toward flavor. So activating volatile aromatics inside of spices, so like browning cumin seeds before adding them into a blender, sort of unlocks all these beautiful perfumes. We also see like the browning effect. So browning is incredibly desirable. It takes and just transforms foods. There's nothing that compares in the kitchen in terms of like depth of flavor than what we can achieve with browning. Now, browning sort of comes in two forms. We have caramelization and we have the Maillard reaction. So we'll start with caramelization. Caramelization is a reaction between sugar. It happens about 340 Fahrenheit. So what we have here is sucrose. So imagine we have this molecule of sucrose and it hits 340 degrees and it violently splits apart into two parts. And it degrades into glucose and fructose. Now, glucose and fructose are much freer in how they behave. They release more of their compounds and give them to other parts within the whole. So we're able to achieve things like bitter, acid, floral, all of those sort of yummy flavors that we get in like a really deep burnt caramel. This is found a lot with like browning vegetables, right? So we're going for a caramelization effect. The thing to watch out for this is that vegetables that have higher sugar content are going to brown and scorch faster. They'll move through that reaction a lot quicker because their sugars are more readily available. For instance, if you have a potato that's fresh out of the ground, it's going to have a higher sugar content because it hasn't had time for those simple sugars to break down into carbohydrates and further into starches. So using an older aged potato is better for frying or making hash browns or something of that nature because its sugar content is lower. It's going to take longer to convert those starches into sugars to caramelize. On the other side of the browning effect, we have the Maillard reaction. So the Maillard reaction is a transformation similar to caramelization, but it involves amino acids in addition to sugar. This is primarily talked about in proteins. We talk about it a lot with meats, but it does exist in vegetables as well because amino acids are part of everything. But my focus in this is going to be a bit more on proteins. So at really high temperatures, an amino acid will grab onto a carbohydrate and kind of shake itself until it converts into a different compound. So for instance, with a cut of beef, beef is loaded with the amino acid lysine. Lysine will bind onto a carb and then transform itself into thiophene. Thiophene is actually found in garlic. It's a compound that exists already, but we can achieve that flavor by creating the Maillard reaction, by browning, so that we have a deeper, richer flavor and texture, honestly, in that cut of meat. There's this sort of misnomer that when you're making like a stew or a roast, that searing or browning sort of seals in the juices or the flavor. That's not actually true. What browning does is it just creates depth of flavor. So you have this sense that there's more going on there. That's why it's really important when you're doing like a full chuck roast or something to really make sure you brown all those sides really hard before putting it into your braising liquid, because you want to achieve as much flavor from that piece of meat as you can. In that same vein, talking about meat and proteins, the heat beyond the Maillard reaction, it can also produce different reactions within protein. So we can think of proteins as these sort of like coils, right? They're kind of floating around in water. They're all just kind of packed in with each other. Now, when this protein is heated up, it stretches itself out. It uncoils and unravels itself. And then as it heats up, it'll slowly come back together. Eventually, we will be set and there will be water trapped inside of that protein structure. But if we continue to heat and push the protein structure further, it'll get tight and squeeze out all of that moisture that's been trapped inside. We can think of like a chicken breast here. So we go from raw and flabby to perfectly set and juicy, and then beyond that to chalky and dry. So, and in some cuts, like pork shoulder, for instance, it'll get to that dry, sort of overly tightened phase. But if you continue to cook it even longer, it'll eventually unravel itself. This is really only true of red meats, lamb, beef, pork for the most part. It doesn't really happen in poultry or fish. Sorry, I lost my place, guys. So that's that. When we're talking about tough cuts, so things like roasts or a whole leg of lamb or even a whole rabbit, these things, they need time. They are loaded with connective tissue and collagen. And the way to break this down is there's two different methods. There's a little bit of it can happen using an acid, but a lot of it will happen with low and slow heat. So braising, stewing, slow roasts, even smoking. because it is such a low temperature, it'll slowly convert that collagen into gelatin. Gelatin is it's what sets up Jello, but it also sort of creates those silky, smooth textures in a really nice stock or in a soup. It coats your tongue and really sort of brings all that rich flavor right into our mouths. On the other side, we have tender cuts of meat, so pork chops, chicken breast, fillets of fish. All of these things do better with fast and fiery cooking methods, so on a grill or very quickly under a broiler, or even in an oven at a high temperature. This is because there's moisture loss. These thinner cuts, these sort of more tender pieces of protein, they degrade very quickly, and they don't have a lot of fat to protect them from the breakdown of the proteins and the retightening. So it's important that we sort of keep an eye on these things. Red meat, for instance, cooks at about 140 degrees is when the protein structure is sort of set perfectly. Beyond that, it'll start to really tighten and push everything out. That's why a medium rare steak will be much juicier than a well-done steak. If we look at chicken and turkey, though, this happens at a much higher temperature, around 160 Fahrenheit. And for fish, lower, 120 really is where we're trying to hit. Now, this, like I said, a lot of this comes from moisture loss. The longer something is on a cooking surface or in an oven or on a grill, whatever it might be, the more moisture you're going to lose through evaporation and through the tightening of the protein structure. So in order to sort of curb that, one of the biggest tools you can utilize in your kitchen is by letting things come up to room temperature before you start cooking with them. Think of a whole roast chicken. If it's in a refrigerator, it's at temperatures below 40 degrees. And it needs to really come up to 160 to be finished, right? Now that core, that center, is at 40 degrees, let's say, when you pop a cold chicken right into the oven. By the time that core even reaches room temperature, the outside, the outer layers of the breast, the thigh, and the leg are going to be 130, 140, almost at that 160 mark where they'll be perfectly set. So in order to continue cooking and get the center of that bird all the way up, we have to take those outside bits and they go beyond the 160 mark, making for a dry Thanksgiving turkey. So putting your protein out on the counter for a period of time before you start cooking helps you to better judge your cooking time, and also it'll make things work more consistently for you. The biggest mistake that some people make with temperature is not accounting for carryover. So carryover cooking, when something is temped, let's say, I have a nice piece of steak in a pan, and I temp that. It's right at where I want it, 140, okay? Now I pull that off, it'll continue to cook over. There will continue to be some heat because of the pan that it's in, but also its own nature. Fattier cuts like brisket, for instance, will carry over much further because fat cools slower than water. Roasts and legs of, like a whole leg of lamb, those can carry over anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees, but smaller cuts even are prone to this, like fish. Fish could carry over as much as 5 to 15 degrees, depending on the cooking method. So make sure you're keeping an eye on your temperatures. The best way to do that is really by owning a kitchen thermometer. I mentioned this when we were doing chicken thighs in the last lesson. Cheap, easy to find, and it's going to save you a ton of money in the long run from having undercooked or overcooked food. It's a very valuable tool. I highly recommend it for everybody. And you can find those cooking temperatures online. You can just, Google it and cook to your preference, but also remember to keep in mind food safety when you're cooking. The last little thing I want to talk about with heat is the absence of heat. So food tastes different at different temperatures. At scorching hot temperatures, your tongue can't taste anything because it's being burnt. You're literally destroying the taste buds. But if we go a little further than that, we let it drop down to room temperature, those flavors are more available. This is also true when something is cold and then brought up to room temperature. A great way to experience this is to take a piece of cheese or salami from the fridge. Leave a piece of it out on your counter for just a few minutes, let it come up to room temperature, and then try that side by side with another piece directly from the fridge. Those fats and salts in that piece of meat or in the cheese are much more available to you at room temperature, and you'll be able to taste all the nuances within it. But on the opposite side of that coin, things that are bright and acidic are much more noticeable at lower temperatures. So lemon juice has a bit more of a bitter, acrid taste at high temperatures, whereas when it's cold, it'll be bright and sparkly. So that's the quick of it. I know that was kind of long, but I think we covered most of the heat there. Does anyone have questions on anything that I mentioned in the lecture portion?
Good.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
So just going on with the, the proteins continue to cook after you remove them. So how would you manage that? So first, I guess I'd say, would you remove the pan?
Yeah.
Heat source?
Some of it is trial and error. A lot of it is getting it out of the heat source. So like I cook a lot in cast iron, which retains heat really well. So like if I'm, resting a steak after frying it or whatever it might be, I move it out onto a cooler surface, a room temperature surface, so that it is able to cool more evenly and quickly. But some of that is just knowing, it's again, like learning your process and doing it over and over again.
Also, you pull it out usually about 5 degrees before.
Yeah, most beef, lamb, things of that nature, I do pull those out, and fish especially. I pull those out about 5 degrees before my target, because I know that they're still going to cook further. Poultry, because of salmonella, I do take it right up to 165 just for safety reasons. But it's even with pork now, there's less fear of parasites and things like that. That's sort of been eliminated, so we can cook those at lower temperatures.
Last question with that, John.
Yeah, sure.
Do you remove it from the pan itself and put it just on a neutral, like a room temp surface?
Yeah, I do it on like a cutting board or or like if you're baking, like onto a cooling rack, onto a plate would even work. The one thing I will say with most proteins is you don't want to go right into cutting them. You do want to let them rest for a period of time, because what will happen is as they cool down, that protein structure, at first it's going to expand massively and release a ton of that liquid. But then as it cools slightly, it'll suck that back up. So if you cut right into it, you're just going to see juice everywhere on the plate. Cool. Any other questions about the lecture? All right. So with that, we're going to get started on some of the recipes. So today we are doing two things, demonstrating a high heat recipe and a very low heat recipe. So we're going to start by working with our Brussels sprouts. So I grew up thinking that Brussels sprouts were really kind of gross. I know a lot of people also feel that way, but I think it's because I hadn't ever had them prepared properly. Brussels sprouts are highly sulfuric. They contain a lot of really kind of eggy compounds, but when they're treated with high heat and they go through the Maillard and the caramelization reactions, they transform and they're much more tasty, in my opinion. So what we've done is I've got some Brussels sprouts here that I cut in half. These were relatively small, so I only did in half. If you have really big Brussels sprouts, you could cut them to quarters, or if you want to do thirds by sort of doing them at a not at a cross section, but more of like a slice. That's also an option. But what we're doing there is we're achieving surface area so that we have something to brown, and we're also just making it so that they cook a little more evenly. What I did after I cut them, I just oiled them lightly. I've got a cast iron pan here heating up. I'm going to bring that over in just a second. What we want with this is the highest hottest heat possible. I'm trying to get my cast iron to the right up to the smoke point so that we can get as much browning here as we can. All right. We'll bring that cast iron over here. Now, when we're browning vegetables in a pan, or meat, anything really, we need to take into account the size and shape of our pan. This particular cast iron is quite shallow. You can see it doesn't have really long sides, and it's quite wide. This will allow for the steam to escape and encourage browning, caramelization, and the Maillard reaction. We also don't want to crowd the pan. The tighter we pack everything in, the more steam that's generated, which prevents us from getting to those higher temperatures. Water converts to steam at 212 Fahrenheit. We need to go above that 230 up to 340 to really get all of those benefits of browning. So I'm only going to put a handful of these in to start with. And I'll come back to those in a minute. I like to try and get them face down just because I find that, you know, you get more browning, more flavor that way. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but there's a lot of nice little crackling sounds. We're getting lots of contact with the pan. Again, the hottest heat we can get. And the oil also acts as a transfer. So oil heats up and holds on to heat a lot better. I mentioned that, you know, when we were talking about larger cuts of meat. It facilitates browning because it moves moisture away quickly. It moves water away quickly and will help sort of get the browning happening a lot quicker. So what am I looking for here? You don't want to agitate these too much because the longer they're in contact with the pan, the hotter they get, the closer they get to that caramelization. If you're moving them around a lot, they're not touching the bottom of the pan. They're not getting that heat transfer that we need. So I'm listening for sound. I'm hearing lots of crackling. That's water sort of bursting out of the cells and turning into steam. I'm smelling. I can sort of smell those deeper, richer flavors kind of coming out. And I can also see that just on the edge of some of these leaves, I'm getting a little bit of darkness. I am going to check one here. We're just going to flip that over. So we have some light browning, not nearly enough. We're just going to let that keep going for a bit here. I am going to add just a touch of oil to the pan to get these things kind of working. You don't want too much because it'll cause a lot of sputtering, but just enough to kind of keep things lubricated and moving around.
Janet had a question, by the way.
Oh, sure.
What kind of window of time is optimal to leave meat out? Say a 1-inch thick cut.
Yeah, sure. So the leaving things out on the counter, going back to that, you do want to make sure that you're being safe in terms of food safety. You don't want things out forever. But like a larger, thicker cut, you know, a 1-inch isn't really all that thick. That really only needs maybe 20 minutes at most. But like a big, you know, like a full chicken, like you're talking a good hour at least. But again, just check the temperature. Put something out on the counter, grab your thermometer, pop it in, and see where it's at. If it's still pretty cold, wait a little longer if you can. If you really have to get going with it, that's fine, but you're going to end up compromising your flavor a little bit. With thinner cuts, it can happen pretty quickly. You know, the thing that you want to avoid is leaving things too long so that you end up with bacterial growth or whatever it might be. But if you're using proper cooking technique and methods that are gonna prevent, anything from getting into, contaminating your food and making you sick, then you're okay to leave it out on the counter for a period of time. Get into the habit of, coming home from work and then pulling your, protein out of the fridge for the night and letting it sit on the counter until you start cooking. All right. Starting to get a little darker here on some of these. Great. You see like this one? Got like that nice rich brown. I'm trying to get it to focus there. See if I can. So we've got this nice rich brown sort of, it's almost black in some places, which is great. So I think we're gonna pull most of these now. So I've got a separate pot here. I'm gonna grab my pan, kind of shake these out, and then do one more batch. Add a little oil in there.
Show that whole pan cook for me.
Oh, sure, yeah. So here we have our nicely browned Brussels sprouts. They've gone through caramelization. They've hit that Maillard reaction. They're loaded with lots of these beautiful flavors. Like I can smell it right now. They smell beautifully charred and sweet, sort of mustardy, loaded with flavor that they didn't have before and that you can't achieve in a raw Brussels sprout.
And the burning brings out like a sweetness.
Yeah, I mean, you're concentrating the sugars. That's another thing. You're moving water away, which will concentrate sugars, make things sweeter. Caramelizing onions, for instance. Fun fact, actually. What we call caramelized onions are actually Maillard onions, but the terms are used interchangeably. The amount of sugar in an onion is negligible. The sweeter the onion, obviously, the more caramelization you're going to get. But really what you're looking at is the Maillard reaction because there's so many amino acids loaded in there. This recipe can also be done using other greens. I did this with kale the other day. Absolutely beautiful. Again, you just want to make sure that you're not crowding your pan so that there's plenty of room for everything to kind of breathe, give off all that water, and really get in contact with the bottom of your pan.
If the pan's too crowded, it's basically going to steam the vegetables.
Yeah, so if there's, if it's too crowded, this is actually kind of tight. I should have done this maybe a little less packed. But you see, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there's steam rolling off the edges here. The higher the pan, the more rolling you're going to get, and that steam is going to go back down to the bottom of the pan. And it's going to just continue to sort of steam everything rather than getting that nice burnt caramel kind of color. When we have a lower profile pan, it's not as crowded, the steam moves out and away. So if you were trying to do this in like a stock pot, for instance, you're never going to be able to achieve a real rich caramelization because the steam is just constantly rolling over itself. There's a question in the chat, it looks like. I always burn my onions when I try to caramelize. Any tips? Yeah, so some of that is because you're probably, sorry, let me flip these around. Your heat might be too high. Your fat might be the wrong fat. One of the things that I found is what fat you're cooking with. A lot of people tend to use butter to saute and brown, and really the butter has such a low smoke point. It'll burn very, very at lower temperatures. So that encourages that sort of bitter, acrid kind of flavors because you have burnt butter in there. With onions, I prefer to use like a neutral oil. I cook with peanut oil a lot. You could also use vegetable oil, animal fat, any of those things will work. But with onions, I find that high heat temperatures are not ideal for caramelization. They're good for searing. All right, so that's those. Look at this one. That is so beautiful. That nice, vibrant brown color. I don't know if we can get it there. Look at that, just gorgeous. All right, that comes off. Back onto high heat here, because I am going for a seared onion here, not a caramelized onion. because again, this is a high heat recipe. Touch of oil again. Chopped onion here. This is about half of a medium onion. You could go more, but I'm trying to be a little conservative these days because getting some ingredients is a little more difficult than it used to be. I'm going in there. And again, we're starting to break down those sugars and really release some of that steam too. Oh, that smells so good. I love the smell of frying onions. It's one of my favorite things. So again, we don't want to agitate this pan too much. We want it to kind of do its own thing naturally. Let it go. Get some of that, you know, dark color from the bottom of the skillet here. Have a sip of water. Where are we at on time? 4 o'clock. All right. Let me toss these real quick. So I'm just starting to get some color in there. There's actually a Brussels sprout leaf, but that's okay. We're getting just a touch of color in there. So I'm gonna go in now with my spices. So in this container, I have chili powder, chili flakes, and smoked paprika. So the smoked paprika is going to sort of enhance those nice smoky burnt flavors in the Brussels sprouts. The chili is gonna add a lot of heat, and then the chili powder is to add more of like a sort of floral and subtle kind of aroma. We're gonna bloom this in the oil. Like I mentioned before, a lot of spices have fat-soluble aromatics, where their compounds are more volatile in hot fat. So we're gonna throw that in real quick. Grab my spatula, move that around. You don't want this to be in there too long because you will start to burn some of the spices. So we're just getting that to bloom. Once it's nice and fragrant, it's hitting your nose, we're gonna go in with some roughly chopped garlic. And again, garlic, you don't want to go too long on this, especially at high temperatures, because it'll burn, it'll get quite acidic and quite bitter very quickly. So we're stirring this now because we don't want as much contact at the bottom of the pan. We want to make sure that garlic is just starting to brown, just cooking through, and we'll smell it. You'll really get that sort of whiff of garlic as it starts to break down and caramelize. And then in with some chicken bouillon dissolved in a couple tablespoons of water. Ooh, that's nice and spicy. Yeah, I'm going for it. All right. So now we're hydrating all those spices. We're making sure our onions and garlic are cooked through, nothing raw, nothing bitter. And now we're moving away from that super, super hot heat to sort of get a nice gentle cook on everything here.
Have you been adjusting the flame throughout?
I haven't. My flame's been on high the whole time. Once this starts to reduce down, I might drop it down to about medium. But right now, I'm just trying to get that liquid to kind of dry up a bit. So I am going to leave it on high. I'm going to add just a little bit of honey for some sweetness. Stir that in. That's also going to create a nice thick sauce so it clings to those Brussels sprouts nicely. All right, and then if we look here, that sauce is just sticking to the back of the spoon, sliding off pretty slowly. That's the texture I'm looking for. So we're gonna go back in with our Brussels sprouts, toss those into our little sauce mixture here. Make sure everything's nice and covered. I am gonna drop it down to about medium heat at this point. Now, I didn't add any salt at any point here, except in the bouillon. And that's because the bouillon does have such a high salt content. I didn't want to overwhelm the dish, but I am going to give it a quick taste here, see where we're at for salt, if we need to add any. Oh my, it's so good. No salt. It's perfect. It's really, really yummy. The Brussels sprouts are still a little crunchy in the center, so I'm gonna pull them off right now. Get that off the heat. Now, like I said, because this is cast iron, it's gonna continue to cook. So those Brussels sprouts will get a bit softer, but it's really nice when they still have kind of that crunch and bite to them. And that's it on that dish. This is best served right around room temperature or just a little warm. You don't want this to be hot. And even cold, this is really nice as a cold salad. Any questions about high heat cooking techniques?
From Hunter, would it be possible to make a bunch of the sauce beforehand, then just reheat it?
Yeah, sure. Why not? It's just a glaze. It's pretty simple. That's something that would reheat really easily, and it would hold well. And it's a yummy glaze for any vegetable, any protein. Really, anytime you reduce. So bouillon is basically just chicken stock by it's been reduced and sort of dried or made into a paste. But anytime you take stock and reduce it down into a thick glaze with spices and onions, so good. So good. So yeah, I would definitely say you could make that sauce beforehand and then chuck it in the fridge and keep it for a few days, reheat it, reuse it. Totally. Any other questions about high heat?
Which oils, fats have the highest smoking point?
Cool. So that question is awesome. I love that we're thinking about these things. I want to go into that more in a lesson about fat, but I will kind of cover it here because high heat does sort of change these things. Like I said before, I use peanut oil, which it's very high. Like you can get it like scorching hot, and it won't burn right away. Canola oil, corn oil, vegetable oil, anything that's highly refined is usually, it has a pretty high smoke point. Grapeseed, safflower. The oils you want to avoid, like I cook with extra virgin olive oil at low temperatures, so like sauteing or just to add flavor at the end of a dish or on top of a salad. But extra virgin olive oil is not a high heat oil. It'll burn, it'll scorch, it gets acrid very quickly, and it actually has some carcinogenic compounds when it gets that hot. So I would avoid using extra virgin olive oil for high heat cooking.
For these Brussels sprouts, for example, you wouldn't use.
Yeah, I would never, for something that's that hot, I would never use extra virgin olive oil. You could use processed olive oil, but again, you can't get it as hot as some of those other processed oils. Ghee, clarified butter, those have relatively high smoking points, as well as other animal fats. So, rendered pork fat, duck fat, beef tallow, all of those. All right. So we're going to move from the high heat recipe into a low heat recipe. Now, I've mentioned before, I mentioned it in the last lesson, I mentioned it again when I was doing the Brussels sprouts here. I like cooking in cast iron. I love cast iron. I could go on and on about it. But it has its limitations. For something that's low and slow, the nonstick surface of a cast iron is not perfect. The nonstick on cast iron works great at high heat temperatures because it is a polymerized layer, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go into it. But for this, I am going to be using a very thin nonstick skillet. I keep this around for this purpose. I really don't use it for anything else. What we're going to be doing here is we're making an omelet. Now, this is a recipe that's sort of I came up with. It's a combination of a couple different egg techniques. There's lots of different styles of omelet. Most of you are familiar with the American style omelet, which is cooked very quickly and loaded with filling. I'm not a huge fan of American style omelets. I find them to be a bit greasy. They're often like the egg is dry or overcooked. And I eat them, but they're just not my favorite thing. If we look at, for instance, a French omelet, which is cooked very slowly, it has a much softer texture. Now, my problem with the French omelet is that it's often a little runny. And as much as I love a runny yolk, I can't stand a runny white. And so the French omelet for me is often just a little too loose. There's also a third style that I'm really partial to, and that's the Japanese style omelet. A Japanese style omelet is rolled, so it's done in a very thin layer. Sort of like if any of you have ever been to a sushi house, you can get tamago yaki, which is it's an egg roll. So literally they cook the egg and then slowly roll it to make a thick sort of piece of egg for sashimi or to put on top of rice. I love it. I think it's nice, soft, creamy, beautiful layers, nice texture, but it's not usually filled. Japanese omelets are sort of left, on their own. The same with French omelets; they're never really filled. What I've done with this technique is I've sort of combined those. So we have the slow, gentle heat of a French omelet, the filling of an American omelet, and the rolled technique of the Japanese omelet. So we're gonna start on the lowest possible heat here, maybe just a touch above low. And I'm gonna get my pan heating up. I mentioned when I was doing the cast iron that preheating, I was preheating the pan. That's still essential here. Even though we're going for low temperature, I still want to get the pan warm so it's ready to work with. Now, the prosciutto. Wait, first we gotta do the prosciutto. So one of the fillings I'm doing is a crispy prosciutto. It's one of my favorites. So I'm just gonna pop a different cast iron over the flame here, medium, high. And I'm actually gonna go into the pan while it's still cold. So this is just simple slice of prosciutto. I'm gonna go into a dry pan there. And what I'm doing, I'm trying to render out some of the fat. So there's all these white strips of fat in the prosciutto. And what that does is this rendering is gonna, make it less greasy. And it'll also help to kind of crisp things up nicely. I really like doing crispy prosciutto, especially for breakfast. It sort of just elevates it. It's like bacon, but just so much fancier and tastier, in my opinion. But you can do this with any deli meat. Like if you, the way that I fill this omelet is I just look through the fridge and whatever I have laying around, like that's my omelet filling. I don't go for, specific things. So for instance, I had an open package of prosciutto, so I'm going for some prosciutto. If you have salami, fry up a little piece of salami. Turkey, go for it. Whatever suits you. We also had some sauteed spinach, which I've combined here with a little bit of feta. So our omelet today is going to be filled with spinach, feta, and crispy prosciutto. But you could fill this omelet with really anything, as long as it's not super chunky. I find that really thick pieces of meat or heavy cheeses don't do well because they'll rip the egg. But nicely chopped herbs, a sprinkle of Parmesan or Pecorino Romano. Really any of those have a really great home here with this omelet. Is there anything you wanted to add with that too?
Basically you're using a vegetable, a meat, and a cheese, right?
Yeah.
And any combination of those are always yummy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to speed this up, I am going to add a tiny bit of fat. So this is sort of a medium technique, I guess is what you could say. OMG, yum. I know, right? Those are good flavors. I'm excited for this omelet. Not gonna lie to you guys right now. I wish you could be here. So like I was saying, so this is a medium heat cooking technique. It's not super hot, it's not super cold. We're just kind of right in the middle there, which is how you achieve that nice even caramelization, but not that over the top, really pushing it to the limit. Right here, we're just looking to render out the fat and crisp up that protein a little bit. So this is just about where I want it. We're starting to see some caramelization here, that sort of rich brown color, little blonde. We're gonna pull that off. Because this is a very thin piece of meat, it is very fatty. This is gonna crisp up on its own. I've just applied just enough heat to pull out the moisture and allow that fat to come out of it. So back on with our nonstick skillet, down to that low flame.
This is from Hunter. Whenever I make an omelet, my eggs always stick to my pan, even when it's supposed to be non-stick. Why it do that?
There's a couple reasons. One, you're probably not using enough oil, or you're using butter, and your heat's too high. Eggs, they coagulate at around 100 and I want to say it's 140, 130, 140, something like that. And it happens very quickly. Like eggs go from 0 to 60 in no time. And so when you put cold eggs into a scorching hot pan, it's going to create an instant layer of coagulated, burnt protein. And then that's going to separate, because now all the water that was in that layer has sort of popped out of it and sort of underneath the uncoagulated raw egg, and you're going to get that sort of burnt bottom layer. I think low temperatures are the way to go with most eggs, or just a ton of fat. If you're going for like that crispy fried egg, like there's like one of my favorite things is like a nice plate of like sauteed greens with a crispy fried egg on top. So good. But the only way you can achieve that is by just heaping fat into your pan and going at a very high temperature. The issue becomes what fat you use. So again, to that same issue, don't use butter. Butter is delicious in scrambled eggs because it adds milky texture and flavor, but it is not a cooking oil. Butter, in my opinion, it's for flavor. It is not for cooking. But yeah, it could also just be that your nonstick pan hasn't been treated well, whatever it might be. I'm not a huge fan of nonstick. Again, I really only use this because it's the best way to do this style of omelet. American style omelets don't work.
We have a question from Gabe. Maybe I missed it. What kind of oil do you use for eggs?
For eggs, I use, well, it kind of depends how I'm feeling, what I have around. I use peanut oil for virtually everything. I'm using peanut oil today. You could use a little ghee if you're, sorry, the pan's kind of hot. You could use a little ghee. You could use a little vegetable oil. If you got some, animal fat laying around, that's always yummy. Like I said, neutral oils are really the place to go. Lower temperature cooking, you can get away with using like extra virgin olive oil, but it could create sort of a sticky kind of situation if the oil gets too hot.
And then Hunter asked, why does butter make it stick?
So what's happening is in the butter, it's a combination of milk fat and milk solids. So the fat is the clarified butter, the oil, and the solids are like the sugars that are in there. And what happens is those sugars burn at a much lower temperature than the oil. So there's all these little bits of burnt milk floating around in your butter that cause like sticking. Those are sticky, right? So think of when you make a caramel sauce, that sugar gets really thick and sticks to the bottom of the pan if it's not being moved well. The same thing happens on a much smaller scale. And so what you're getting is sort of this binding effect of the burnt sugars in the butter. All right, so in this pitcher, I have 6 eggs in here, but that's because we're doing 3 each. This is a much larger version of this omelet than I do most of the time. That's because we're doing this for dinner. This is our big meal for the day. What I've done here is I've just whisked them all. You can use a fork to whisk your eggs, but like, I don't know, just use a whisk. It's gonna break them up nicer. It's gonna get those whites really emulsified into the yolks. So what we're going for here is just a thin layer of this egg mixture. I did oil this pan. I took an oiled paper towel and just kind of ran it around the bottom to give us a thin layer of oil. Now I'm going to take and just pour enough egg in here that we're going to cover the bottom. We're going to swirl that around. And you can see the egg has already started to set across most of the pan. And that's because, again, eggs set at lower temperatures. They don't require that much heat to do their job. So once that's kind of swirled in a nice thin layer, I'm just going to take a spatula here, push those edges down. We're going to let that sit over the heat for just a second so that that sort of loose bit there starts to coagulate. I'm going to take a little bit of my filling here, a little bit of the spinach and cheese. I'm just going to go sort of toward the center. And again, you don't want a ton of this in there. You're not trying to stuff it. You're just trying to add a little flavor. Take a little piece of the prosciutto, drop that in there. And I am going to hit this with just a touch of black pepper. Then we're going to take our spatula. Once we see that the egg is basically set, we're going to kind of push one side about a third of the way across the pan. And then I'm going to start trying to roll. So the plan here, it's a little wet still, so I'm going to wait just a second. I'm actually going to take up my heat just a touch. So what you're really looking for here is a drying out of the edges and that sort of those puddles of coagulated egg to really stop jiggling. So we're going to continue to roll, making sure that filling is nicely enveloped in egg. All right, and then you're going to have a little bit of a tail at the end there. The best way to do it is to just flip it up onto the roll you've already started. Then we're going to re-oil our surface. Clear up any of those little bits of egg that got stuck to the bottom of the pan. We're going to add just enough egg again to cover the bottom. We're going to roll that around. Hit those edges. This pan did get kind of cold.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on. It was just a little too low. All right. And then we're going to take that roll. We're going to just lift up the edge and let some of that egg get underneath so that it starts to seal the previous roll with the new sheet that we're forming here. Again, I'm going to hit it with a little bit of my filling. All right, then we're going to use that spatula one more time.
Pepper.
Push down the edges. I did pepper. Push down the edges. So we're not looking for any color on this omelet. What we're looking for here is just barely set egg. So as we get a little bigger here, this is going to roll a lot easier. And then it just flips over. So I'm going to push this back to the other edge of my pan again and repeat this process one more time. Little oil. And in with our egg. Now this last layer, I'm going to do just a touch more egg than the first two because I do want it to be a little thicker. I want it to sort of really hold everything together nicely. While I still have some liquid egg there, I'm going to lift that edge again. Get that right in there. But this time I'm going to use very, very little of the filling because I want this last roll to really be sort of what seals everything together. It's really important that this edge here, we try to keep that free of any topping so that way it seals nicely. Hit it with a little pepper. Last little bits of prosciutto. All right, and then the final roll here, right onto itself. Then we're gonna just kind of push that back to the center of the pan. Now I am gonna leave this on the heat for just another minute, but you'll see there's no browning on that egg whatsoever. Where am I? There we go. There's no browning on that egg whatsoever. It's soft, it's supple, it's just barely set. And what that is, that's so creamy, so tender. It's just this beautiful, delicate omelet, just flavored lightly with all of our fillings. It's beautiful on the plate. It really is. I'm gonna flip it one last time here, let it really set. And then we're good to go. And that'll go onto a plate, which I did not grab. Would you mind grabbing a plate? So that's the roly-poly omelet, you guys. This one was, like I said, this is a 3-egg omelet. You could do it slightly smaller. If you really want just the roll, go for it that way. The filling is completely up to you. So our little omelet there on our plate. I'm gonna garnish it with just a little bit more of that filling that's inside, give you a taste of what's in there. And there she is. Is she party? Okay. Any questions about that recipe or really anything? Anything we covered last week or?
I would ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hey, John.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
So do you recommend like a very shallow pan like that for eggs? Like we have a standard nonstick. I don't know what size it would be, but do we have to have a super shallow one to make?
No, you could do it in virtually any nonstick. I like this one because it's super shallow, easy to get into, and it's very wide. So I'm able to create a really long sort of omelet. The smaller the pan, the tighter the roll is going to be, and you're going to get just like a very fat kind of pudgy roll.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else with questions, comments? All right. Where are we at? No problem, Leslie. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. Anybody else?
I just think it's great that you taught us like a new way to make omelets. I've never made it like that before.
Yeah, it's a little slower than a traditional. Some of that is also because I'm talking, but I think it's superior. I haven't really made an omelet another way in a long time, just because it's so tender, it's so soft, and it's not this like big, heavy, pudgy grease bomb. It's just a nice, light, delicate little omelet there. Oh, sure. I can try to do a cross section. So we will cut it sort of here.
Put it more in the frame.
Yeah, I'm going to. I'm just gonna try to cut it and pull up a piece.
Oh man.
So there's our little cross section here.
Oh my gosh, that looks.
You can see it's still slightly set, cheesy.
Oh, yeah, it looks kind of raw though.
Like this is like right perfectly set for me. You can sit it on the burner a little longer if you want it a little.
Now we're talking.
As long as you keep it low.
Cooked hard. Kathy, your stuff has to be cooked.
Absolutely. No, and there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. You just want to make sure that you're not getting that cut. Because with eggs, for me, that burnt flavor is just not something I go after, especially in something so soft and supple. Now, what I really love about this also is that you get that nice sort of flaky spiral. So you get these sort of beautiful sheets of just perfectly set egg, which I think you can kind of see there with the, but I will say, Kathy, I don't don't think. I think some of that's the feta. I think some of that's the
I'll give you that. I'll give you that. A little bit. But a little bit. Just a little bit. That's okay. It's beautiful and it does look good. But like I said, I need it cooked.
That's all good. Take it a little further. Anybody else out there? All right, well, I guess that's it for the day, you guys. Like I said, this was a shorter lesson than last time. I'm hoping to do this again next weekend. Some of that depends on how quickly I can put another lesson together, what we have in the fridge, all that kind of stuff. One question here. Where could we find the recording? You're amazing to watch, and I'd love a refresher when I try to make this myself. So, Sarah, I don't have your contact information, but Shane, if you can send her my phone number, I can send a link once the video is up on YouTube.
You can watch the older one.
And the older one is also available. The first lesson, Welcome to My Kitchen. But yeah, I'm trying to keep an archive of these so that people can reference them. If anyone's interested in the written recipes, I will say these are my personal recipes. They're not ones that I pulled out of a cookbook. So the formatting is a little haphazard and the ingredient list is a bit of an improvisation in terms of quantities, but I have given what I think my rough estimates are, and I've used those rough estimates while I was cooking today.
Hey, John, I would love the written recipe for last lesson.
Yeah, I also have, I can send that out. I have that.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, totally. I'll try to make sure it's also posted with the YouTube video, so that way you have it as a reference there.
Perfect. That would be perfect.
What is your YouTube channel name?
My YouTube channel name, I don't even know. What is my YouTube channel name? Do you know, Taylor?
I don't know.
I am terrible about branding. I don't do well with marketing myself. But I want to say it's just my name. I think it's just j.mun. But I could be wrong about that. Like I said, I made this YouTube channel years and years ago, and I literally uploaded my first video 2 weeks ago. So we'll get with the branding thing. We'll make sure everything's sort of lined up there. But
Gabe said that he's going to work on branding.
I know. Thank you, Gabe. I appreciate that. Thank you for being my little producer here.
Thanks for doing this. Really, we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're right now because of you.
Thank you.
John.m.
John.m. So my YouTube channel is john.m.
Yep, I found it.
Okay, cool. So thank you, Aunt Janet, for doing a little sleuthing there. It's john.m. Cool. If anybody has anything else, you have my contact information. Please reach out at any time. I love being a resource for you guys. Even if it's something we haven't talked about here in one of the lessons, I'm super happy to provide feedback or pointers or give you some direction with what you've got going on. I know that cooking during this time for me has been a real outlet, and I've really enjoyed bringing all of you here to share that. So thank you once again for spending a little hour and a half here in my kitchen.
Thanks. This is fantastic. Bye, John.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Can't wait till next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Stay safe, stay healthy. Love you all. Bye-bye.